welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us again today. We're continuing our journey through the Daodejing, and this week we are on chapter 50. So making some progress. So this chapter begins between between birth and death. Although maybe a little bit more of a literal translation of this would be something along the lines of being born into life and entering death. So you get a bit of the yin-yang component here where there's life and death, and it's on this continuum, maybe along the lines that we sometimes will use in English of you're born into death, that there's this automatic kind of progression between these two that we don't really have any control over. They're just going to kind of unfold. And the point that they're going to be focusing on in this chapter, the way that they chose to translate this line, is that phase between birth and death. So as we continue this then, it says 3 in 10 are followers of life. 3 in 10 are followers of death. Now, the followers here is also translated as disciples, and we'll see this, I think it's in chapter 76, where it talks about the disciples of life and the disciples of death, and it kind of has different ways that they look at those. But here there's a very unusual phrase that's being used, and it ends up getting translated in several different ways. So here it's saying 3 in 10. Now, the phrase in the actual Chinese text is 10 has 3. And that has been taken as either trying to say 13 or as 3 in 10 or something along those lines. Lot of debate back and forth on which way that should go. So in the way that it's being translated here, the idea, excuse me, the idea is that there are certain percentages of people who fall into the different categories. And there's one more category we'll see here in just a second. So this would be, so many people actually end up being disciples of life, and some end up being disciples of death. And the third set is going to be people who just kind of make their way through life and to death. So that would be one way of understanding this concept. If it is the term for 13, then the implication, according to the earlier commentators on this, is it's referring to different parts of the body. And in our other text that we use, the Addiss and Lombardo translation, in fact, this is how they translate it, the 13 parts of the body. And the idea there is you've got your four, your hands and your feet, and then there's 9 openings. And that
makes up,
and that makes
How
up.
does your head feel?
I'm going to.
You're already listening. Is it?
So then the 13, if it's in reference to the parts of the body, would bring about a different way of thinking about these passages, in that the whole of the body, if it's referring to the 13, is what actually allows you to pursue life, and the fact that your arms and your hands and feet and whatnot help you get around. And then, of course, the different openings. You can breathe, you can eat, you can go to the bathroom, and you can see and you can hear, all those kinds of good things that are needed for life. But those same 13 things end up being the things that lead you towards death, because through their use, you actually end up wearing down the body and have the opportunity to invite in disease through the openings or so forth. So they're kind of, in one sense, it's the physicality that allows you to live, but it's also that same physicality that moves you towards death. So these would be some pretty different ways of understanding what this section is about. Either it's talking about the necessity of the physical body for how we live, but also what brings us towards death, or it is referring to a certain percentage of people who follow a particular way of life, one that leads towards life and one that leads towards death. Um, cannot be decided between these. You've got experts that come down on both sides. But really, I think either works. It probably are both interpretations are bringing out valid points. What the initial author actually intended, it's hard to say at this point. But that's what we have in terms of the different ways that we can look at this opening part. And so it does continue with a third category. Let me get there. And people just passing from birth to death also number 3 and 10, or in the same way, these folks also have just the same 13 body parts. And then he asks the question, why is this? Maybe in particular for this third group, right? So the first group we have, heading towards life. The second group is the disciples of death. And then this third group is just kind of, they're just making their way from life to death. Why is that? So the answer he gives is because they live their lives on the gross level. And gross here you want to think of in terms of big or large, or I think the actual term is thick. So it's kind of an interesting term. We don't often use gross that way, but it's kind of interesting. There's Mardi Gras, which is in a literal translation is Fat Tuesday, which is also could be translated as Gross Tuesday. And so you kind of see that term kind of being brought over in modern day parlance a little bit there.
Yeah, gross in German is big.
Yeah. So it's interesting here. What do they mean, by this? And again, we have kind of a discrepancy in terms of how this is being interpreted. The minimalist nature of the language really allows for a lot of diversity here. But I think one of the key thoughts is that they are living their lives. Well, the two directions they kind of take this is the group of people that are just kind of making their way from life to death and maybe aren't being very intentional about it, that how they're living is maybe in either luxury or in terms of like trying to get everything out of it, right? Like in terms of living big. Now, but the living big isn't seen as necessarily a positive thing. It's almost more like a exorbitant or extravagance. And there's actually going to be a chapter coming up where they use this same term, and it's definitely in a negative sense. So it may be that the idea is this third group that's just kind of making their way from life to death, that they're just living inappropriately. And that might be why that's happening. So then maybe before I get to the next section, because it's going to kind of switch gears here a little bit, what are your thoughts on this first part? Either do you have any opinions about the 3 and 10 versus the 13 parts? And then also, what do you think is implied by this idea of being a disciple of life versus a disciple of death versus people who just kind of make their way through?
Initially took it as 3 and 10, meaning 3 out of 10 people. And I don't know, I think maybe if you're living toward life, then you're focused on experiencing life, but if you're focused on death, you're probably more of a nihilist. And then there are people who are just kind of like ignorance is bliss, maybe.
Just kind of don't bother me with all the details.
Mhm.
Yeah. Anybody else have some thoughts on that? That is interesting, your idea of the disciples of death, this idea of nihilism. The other thought that came to me was people who were living in response to death, like in the sense of running away from it or doing whatever they can to try and, like, their mode of living is trying to avoid death as opposed to trying to live for life, right? So you can be motivated by life is this positive thing that you want to engage in, and or you could be, running from death as another way to be living is, I think, another way that can also be looked at. All right. Well, if there's not any other comments, we'll go on to the next section then. So maybe going back to this first group then, the disciples of life, it says, those who know how to live, walk abroad without fear of rhinoceroses and tigers. Now, obviously, this is a little bit different of a social context than we normally have to worry about right now. Um, and rhinoceroses is also sometimes translated as either buffaloes or water buffaloes. I think it's this idea of like horned animals. I'm not sure how common rhinoceroses were in this place of the world and time, but in either case, you've got large beasts that could be very dangerous that they seem to not have a fear of, or one of the ways that this is looked at. And then it goes on to say, and that they will not be wounded in battle. Now, this has led to all kinds of interesting speculation in terms of later Taoism. You may recall that as you move into more of the religious version of Taoism, there is a heavy emphasis on immortality and how to achieve it. And when they're talking about immortality, they're not so much looking at it as an afterlife kind of how do I persist after dying. It's more of a physical immortality. And this led them to all kinds of quests to find magic elixirs or different concoctions that they could come up with that would bring about long life. Unfortunately, one of the ones that they got thought was going to be powerful was using mercury. Unfortunately, that's not a really good way to go. But there's this idea that this was read in such a way that if you know how to do this properly, whether this is through cultivating different physical traits like breathing and what you're eating, or certain kinds of potions, or even some incantations, that somehow this is going to protect you from being injured by different things. And the way this concludes, there's a spot that also kind of lends itself to that way of thinking. So the question is, what's going on here? And there's a little bit more here that it's going to say, for in them, that is these people who are following life, the rhinoceros finds no place to thrust its horn, nor the tiger to use its claw, and weapons no place to pierce. Final statement again, why is this? Because they have no place for death to enter. And this is maybe in a little bit more of a literal translation. It says, because they have no death spot, which is kind of interesting. So a lot of different, like I said, ways that this has been conjectured as far as what this might mean, and led to some very interesting later paths that people took. What are your thoughts on what's being communicated here about the rhinoceros and the tiger and the soldiers?
I guess like they're not living out of caution of fear, like they're just living. Like they're not afraid to take risks, to go after what they want to experience in life.
So how would
But I
that?
don't know.
Go
Yeah, I
ahead.
don't know how the wounded in battle part comes in. That I'm still, I don't know.
One of my favorite interpretations is one by um, uh, Wayne Dyer.
Mm,
He wrote a version, an interpretation of the Daodejing, and the way he puts this particular passage, at least the part about the soldiers, is it says, weapons turned from him on the battlefield. He's describing the sage, the claws cannot pierce whatever, and it says, weapons turned from him on the battlefield, which to me invokes the image of somebody who's so well liked and so well respected, and somebody who has a reputation as being a peaceful person, that the soldiers aren't going to attack them. Like if like say theoretically Mother Teresa walked into the middle of a battlefield, like the people would stop shooting, theoretically, something like that.
mm-hmm. What did he have to say about the rhinoceros and tiger?
Well, I don't remember the specific wording of that, but to me it goes with the idea that, kind of like Saint Francis, animals will befriend a person who's living in alignment with the way of nature, who's at harmony, who's at inner peace. Animals will befriend them. They won't attack them. They won't incur the hostility of others,
Mm,
their own species or others.
interesting. Yeah. Anybody else have some thoughts on that? So one of the other ways of looking at this has been that the person who is pursuing life would maybe know how not to put themselves in harm's way. So it's more of an idea of either not being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and therefore they're not having to deal with the issues of the tiger and the rhinoceros or the soldiers, or that they're not provoking. So their presence, maybe kind of along the lines of what Dane was saying, is that they're not antagonizing or drawing attention in a negative way from either the animals or from the soldiers. And that's how they're able to preserve life. It is an interesting question that doesn't have a solid answer that everybody agrees on. And like I've said, it's worded in such a way that people have taken this in very different directions, especially this last line here. They have no place for death or no death spot. But it is intriguing and gives you a lot of fun food for thought to kind of ponder the different directions that this might go. And this actually, even though it was a little bit of a longer chapter, is really the core of what we've got for this. So if you have some additional thoughts or questions, either about this chapter or about some other ones, we can take some time on that, or we might just have a little bit of a shorter session today.
I'm thinking about the last line, and maybe it's talking about how they are just resilient and they're not going to give in to living for out of fear of death.
So kind of a
Like we were
reversal
talking about
of
earlier.
yeah. So if that disciples of death was the idea of people running from death in terms of how they're trying to live, then this would mean that they're not being driven by that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah, like a reinforcement of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that idea too. Well, if there aren't any other thoughts that we want to engage in, we can call it an early day today. I'll give you one more option or one more chance.
The can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Rob.
Yeah, I just it would seem to me this is kind of a text that kind of you're going to bring your own perspective to it,
Mm.
Particularly naturalist or supernaturalist. And frankly, I can understand how the later Taoists, looking at the naked words, might interpret it in a more supernaturalist perspective than a naturalist one.
Oh yeah, yeah. It definitely lays the groundwork for that. It's, just a question always of, is that in fact what they were getting at or not? It's hard to say. There's ways to interpret it both directions. And certainly one branch definitely went one direction with this.
And as I say, I think the naked words favor that view.
Mm.
On that note, something that I think is really fascinating about the Daodejing is that it's able to be an uh, an oracle while still being extremely concise. An oracle, uh, the way that I think Stan Groff, I've heard define it, is it's anything that's sufficiently complex to reflect back the contents of the subconscious in the viewer. So um, you it's one thing to take something like huge and complicated and sprawling, like say the Bible, and uh, and make an oracle out of that, because there's enough stuff in there that if you just kind of open to a random page or take an impression, you'll get some kind of impression from it or reflect something back to you about the contents of your unconscious, because there's just so much stuff in there. But for something like the Tao Te Ching, that you could sit down and read through the whole thing in 30 minutes, uh, to be that subtle and have just the right amount of ambiguity that almost anybody can read it, uh, and from the interpretation that they form will reveal something about the nature of their own subconscious.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. It is interesting. Well, I had a couple of very different types of experiences with the Daodejing when I initially came.
Or a better way to describe the property of an oracle is, if you just open it and read some random part of it, it's likely to have some kind of meaning for you where you are in your life right then. It has that kind of property.
Gotcha. Yeah, I when I first came across it, it was in the early 80s. And at that time, I was intrigued by it, but it also was the vagueness of it, or the minimalistness of it was extremely confusing at the same time. Like there was something about it that was very interesting, and I was drawn to it, but I had a very hard time making heads or tails out of it. And it wasn't until a lot later in life, probably at least 20 years later, that I was able to, well, maybe even closer to 30 years, really, bring a different set of life circumstances to it, where I felt like I was able to get a better grasp of what was going on. Not that I would think that there's ever a way to get a perfect grasp of it, but at least to kind of have a better sense of the direction that the text is trying to wrestle with these ideas. And it does have the style of its writing has really helped to make it timeless. In a lot of the other classical Chinese texts, where they tend to spell things out in more detail, they don't have the same kind of timeless quality, because it ends up getting more locked into its own time frame because of all of the particular details that they give to it. So it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing in a sense, in that it makes it more accessible at different time frames in history, but it also lends itself to radically different ways of looking at it, where you have a hard time getting any kind of consensus on what some of the things actually mean. So it's kind of fun and challenging in that way.
But if it was explicit and precise, then it wouldn't have that value as an oracle.
Yeah, yeah. No, I like that. It definitely at different times in my life it has revealed different things and probably will continue to do so.
It's something of that proverbial rubber nose that you can twist in any direction you want to take it.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting at this conference coming up where we've got a theoretical physicist that's going to be speaking, and he has had a lot of concerns about people trying to take ancient texts and use them in some kind of modern sense, because he feels like you can kind of distort them and manipulate them into saying kind of whatever you want. And sometimes in ways that align with modern physics and other times in ways that don't. So it'll be very interesting to see what his take is on how I've been pursuing this. It'll be a fun time.
Is that going to be recorded?
Yes, assuming everything goes as planned.
I was going to ask the same question. It'd be interesting to see it, after the fact, even if you can't be there.
Yeah, that's definitely the goal. So I imagine it's gonna be a lot of fun. I wish I could bring you all there.
Me too.
I want to thank you for joining us again. And if you've been watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of the live presentation or discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get links to this Friday morning Zoom conversation, as well as locations for how we meet on Sunday mornings if you'd like to be a part of the in-person class. And that actually happens on Sunday mornings in the Southern California area. And with that, we look forward to seeing everybody next time. Also, keep in mind that next week there won't be a session next Friday because I'll be at that conference. So that'll come out with an email next week as well to remind you, but just in case you don't get the email, to give you a heads up. All right, guys, we'll see you next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.